You're listening to the Primal Happiness Show, a podcast dedicated to helping you thrive in this crazy modern world. Every Tuesday, we explore the nature of how our minds really work, what exactly the human animal requires to thrive, and how we can live happier and more fulfilling lives. If you're new here and haven't yet taken our free class, then there's no better place to get a jump start on reclaiming your primal happiness. It's where we'll guide you step by step through our antidote to today's modern world. Simply head on over to primalhappiness.co/antidote to get the free class and discover how to thrive without having to move to a planet that's not so crazy as ours. But now, your host, Leanne Brooke-Tyler.
Hello, my beautiful people. A huge warm welcome back to the show. In today's crazy modern world, men and women are living shallow, disconnected, and unfulfilling lives. So we created the path for those who are ready to reclaim their wildness and actualize their deepest gifts. The next way you can walk this path is by joining us for Waking the Wild Medicine, which begins in March. In this crucible, you will uncover the wild medicine of your soul, the gift to the world that you came here to be. You'll create the potent ways to administer this medicine by your own unique embodiment in alignment with divine archetypal energies. You'll be liberated to become the fullest expression of your soul, giving your deepest gifts in service to the world. In material terms, this means you become available for an abundance of connection, impact, and wealth, and anything else your soul desires to flow as you. You can discover more and arrange a call to explore whether this is indeed aligned for you by going to primalhappiness.co/medicine. And Jonathan and I are doing a very special Facebook Live together into the Primal Happiness Facebook group on the topic of why you being your medicine is a gift to the world. That's at 4:30 on Monday, the 24th of January. If you go to the Primal Happiness Facebook group, which is facebook.com/group/primal happiness, you can register your interest on the event there. You can join us live, and there will also be time at the end for you to ask us questions. And if you're listening to this afterwards, you can catch the replay on all our usual channels, including this very podcast. Either way, I hope it is absolute treasure for your ears and another breadcrumb in you becoming your medicine. And now on to this week's show. It's with Steve James. Steve travels internationally teaching somatic practices, meditation, as well as leading explorations in contemplative and relational realms. Known for his direct, grounded approach and his dedication to first-hand research, his extensive experience in elite athletic performance, contemplative and spiritual disciplines, the arts, extreme outdoor survival, and human behavior. Steve's unique range of experiences, understanding of human behavior, high performance, spirituality, and interpersonal relationships is highly sought after by leading figures at the highest levels of the arts, entertainment, and business. Steve is the creator of the Movement Koan Method and the host of the Guru Viking podcast. In this show, we spoke about masculine and feminine polarity, the shadow that's present in some modern polarity teachings, how to recognize when wounds need tending instead of plastering more polarity work over the top of them, how we might benefit most from polarity work by using it generatively instead of in a reductionist way, the masculine and feminine as expansive archetypes rather than rigid stereotypes. This was such a wide-ranging conversation. We went into all kinds of places I wasn't expecting, and I absolutely just loved it. So much so, Steve is fast becoming a regular guest. We're now about to record our third episode, so it should give you some indication of how much I enjoyed having this conversation with Steve. I think you are going to love it too. Let's dive in. Hello, Steve. Welcome to the show.
Hello, Leanne. Thank you for having me.
There's a feeling of deja vu, isn't there?
Somewhat, yeah.
So listeners won't know until I'm about to tell you that Steve and I attempted to do this, I think it was last week, and my internet did not want that to happen. And so we're back, and I feel like it's going to be one of those things, you know, when you're writing a document and then you lose it, And then you're like, oh my goodness, I'm going to write it all from scratch. It's never going to be as good. And then it's always better. I know this is going to be one of those. No pressure, but I've got that feeling. So we have got a really juicy topic. And I think you kind of went, oh, when I reminded you of the topic just now. And I named it something like the shadow in the polarity world, or the shadow in polarity teaching. And I know last time you said you felt helpful if I sort of started by what I was seeing about that, what I mean about that, before I then ask your sense. So I'm happy to do that if that's how you would like us to journey into this.
Yeah, I'm sure. That's the way the topic came up last week, is you had seen something in your coaching program, I think, that had given you this sort of pause for thought. And that's how we started it, and I thought, yes, it's a very interesting topic. We could discuss it. So, do you remember what it was that had inspired that idea in your mind? I think the morning of when we recorded, just that morning, you saw some email or something. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was something that I've been seeing increasingly over the years, and then there was something that happened that morning that was just this kind of like, oh, just like it all just dropped in so clearly. And what it was, and as you'll know, there's been a real surge in the last maybe 2 years in particular of this kind of whole idea of polarity. I mean, it's obviously not a new idea, but in terms of like it becoming this almost like a craze, like a real fad in the coaching industry of polarity teaching. And I think it's a metaphysical law, a truth, something that's very, very powerful. And what I've been increasingly seeing, and again, really dropped in for me last week, was when it's entered into or taught in a way that's a kind of performing over the top of wounding and kind of closures, it becomes this kind of performative thing that then creates its own patterns of behavior that actually are coming from fear, you could say. And there was something that really landed this deeply for me last week in the current program I'm running, Wake and Wild Feminine, I do every year. I'm teaching it through the lens of initiation into the queen, the sovereign, then the wild woman, before we get to the lover. And it's the lover primarily that, and it's not all about polarity by any stretch of the imagination, but if we're going to talk about aspects to polarity, it'll be then. And a couple of them have been saying similar things, a couple of the women, but one in particular said, oh my goodness, I can so see that if we hadn't done the work first to start to recognize where we had shadow and start to look at the world from this kind of more clean and sovereign place, I would have taken a kind of like an understanding of polarity and then used it to almost like manipulate life. So it kind of allowed me to keep everything kind of like still happening in shadow, all the same kind of control and closure, but I guess manipulating herself and her partner in a way that kind of felt like her needs were getting met. It would become like this, again, this like performative manipulation rather than something that was actually a portal into doing deeper work, doing the work of becoming whole. So it was that really landed it for me. Like, this is so important and seems to be something that's not being particularly well seen at the moment. And knowing your background and knowing the depth of your work, it felt like, again, it happened like the morning we were due to talk. I was like, oh my goodness, like it suddenly dropped in. Like, of course, that's what we're meant to be talking about. So I'm going to hand over to you. And just, first of all, I'd love to know your sense of what I've just seen, your understanding about what you've seen about that.
Yeah, well, I think that's very interesting. And if I recall some of the details of that story, the lady had discovered that there was something, she was attempting to address something with certain exercises to increase the attraction between the two of them. Mm-hmm. And in the process had discovered some deeper, if you want, injuries from her past, from her childhood
Yes.
imprints and so on, that were
Yes.
in a way restricting her behavior and making her, if I recall, you said quite kind of shut down and feeling the need to always control everything.
Definitely. Yes. Thank you. I'll name that really quickly because I think that's a really important point. Thank you for remembering. So in this instance, kind of from a polarity lens, it might be, oh, she should be receiving his leadership. And yet what she was noticing is like, in order kind of like to force herself to do that, she'd be ignoring this pattern of control that was in place that was like, again, innocently come by. It was a way of keeping her safe all those years. And she would be overriding that rather than recognizing what was at play. And actually that needed tending. So yeah, thank you for naming that. I think it's an important part.
Yeah, that's very interesting indeed. And I think you make an excellent point that, well, one way I think to think about it could be that there are different, if you want relationships or problems in relationships, there are different sorts of levels of problems. On the one hand, there are skills you haven't got that you could learn, things that you don't know how to do that you could learn, maybe improving communication skills, or like you say, improving sort of skills or exercises or understanding the dynamics of attraction, so that when you're past the honeymoon phase where attraction tends to come naturally and you're deeper into a relationship, you can keep it going or maybe even revive it. You know, a lot of relationships are very loving and nice relationships, but there's not much erotic excitement anymore, or erotic activity going on, I suppose. And so understanding maybe some new information, some new skills about how to generate that can be helpful. So that's sort of adding something you don't have. Then I suppose the next level might be, taking something, changing something like bad habits you've got, perhaps. For instance, a classic bad habit that my co-teacher Michaela Bohm always talks about is on date nights, or talking always about logistics, for example. In other words, not being disciplined about the kind of time one's spending with the partner. Of course, if you're living together or running a household together, there are lots of logistical things to discuss. But if any time you get together is seen as an opportunity to quickly discuss some of the logistics, then in a certain sense, that's not good. So you could say it's a bad habit. It's not a huge problem, but it can make a big difference. So we can learn new skills, we can refine procedures and correct bad habits. But then there are deeper levels of problems, as you correctly say, problems like childhood imprints or even traumas, perhaps from past relationships or things like that. And this sort of thing is not just simply a case of skill acquisition or changing some surface level behaviors necessarily. Some of those deeper issues require a deeper examination, perhaps some therapy, for example, or some and often to be honest with you, we don't realize that we have these things. You said the shadow of polarity, and of course one's shadow is what one can't see. But and anyway, I'm not suggesting trauma is necessarily in the shadow, but certainly sometimes one only discovers these deeper injuries or these deeper patterns from childhood or previous relationships and so on in the process of having a relationship.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, it kind of drives up I think the way you've named it, it's brilliant, as in the trauma itself is known, but the pattern that's been then created from it often isn't. Is that the pattern itself is out of view, and then we start to kind of run up against it in relationship. That's right. Often the kind of like the melting pot for all of it, isn't it? And then it's just like, oh my goodness, I can't have the relationship I want because this pattern's here.
Yes, quite possibly. And if you may not notice that relationships tend to have a sort of homeostasis. A lot of times relationships work on some level. They have a kind of homeostasis. People are coming to this idea of polarity, which from the general understanding of that, it's a kind of way of generating attraction, erotic feeling between two partners. That's the general, I think, idea of it, how to do that. And there may not be much of that going on, but the relationship may be otherwise, if you like, quite civil and quite sort of nice, essentially, but there's no spark. So people come maybe to some polarity person, they like yourself, and they want to increase the spark, right? But that's fine. But then they increase the spark, they learn some new skills, and it can uncover deeper things. And so what do? This is, I think, your point. Do you just keep giving them more stuff, more exercises,
more polarity, more polarity?
Yeah, more polarity. No, of course you have to recognize sometimes that, I think it's the same in the body. If you engage in any new activity, new training routine, or something like this, or you engage in some new thing with the body, you might discover sometimes it's just the stiffness of not having used that muscle in a while. That goes away. Other times you discover, oh no, there's this old injury, I forgot about that, or I didn't realize that, and then you have to maybe get some physiotherapy or something to get rid of that. So you can't keep training.
Kettlebells and sciatica, was that for me?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Some people could just swing the kettlebells with a good form and get the sort of benefit. Other people, like you said, due to maybe structural imbalances or previous injuries or just whatever, bad luck sometimes, you slip on a wet ground or so, you need to do some remedial work or some supportive work. And that's where it's a skilled coach or therapist or, teacher or whatever you want to say comes into play. They're not just simply applying something they've read in a book or applying something that they've seen in a seminar blindly without listening, paying attention to how it's being received and being willing to adjust the strategy or even refer out if the issue that's discovered is beyond the scope of that container or beyond the scope of the expertise of the coach. That's very important, I think.
Yes, very much so. And I love the analogy you've used around some kind of like new physical exercise, because that's going back to this shadow that we're talking about. I think there can be, like, say, for example, there's, great techniques as to have a good form to use kettlebells. I think what I'm seeing happening in the polarity world is it's like, that's the answer to everything. It's just point people back to, that's the right way to use kettlebells. Don't look at any underlying, in my case, the sciatica. Like, ignore the sciatica, just keep pointing to, this is the correct way to use kettlebells. If you do this right, it will be fixed. And it doesn't look to me like that is going to work. Does not look like that's a wise approach. And so I think that analogy, I think, is genius, because that's exactly what I'm seeing happening. What's coming to mind also is I guess what is the objective, or what is the intention or the understanding of polarity? And it feels to me, if we went right to the kind of one end of the spectrum, and certainly the way that I'm seeing a lot of polarity being taught, and not there's anything wrong with this. I think for some people that's perfect and is what's aligned for them, but it's kind of like, this is how to live every part of your life, every aspect of your relationship is from this highly polarized place. I guess if we look at kind of how we are culturally, it's like that doesn't even exist, and we completely ignore any differences. And I think there's like places along that spectrum that are right for different people and according to different circumstances. Firstly, does that make sense to you as a kind of way of describing those things? Yeah,
of course, we're dancing around this idea of polarity and what it means. And I think you're pointing out that it means a lot of different things.
Yes.
And that word is used in a lot of different contexts. And yes, sometimes it can be, actually, sometimes this idea of polarity can become a very reductionist sort of gender role thing, where one has to follow the other all the time. And there's this sort of odd, sort of, I suppose, gender role thing can happen, right? Or this odd kind of thing. Like you say, attempting to fit people into these categories for the sake of the ideology, I think. And it's relationships, sometimes they can be difficult, and they're not predictable, and it's not a one-size-fits-all thing, because relationships involve people. You have the individuals involved, and people are complicated, and interactions are complicated. One of the motivations, I think, for a one-size-fits-all ideological approach is that one gets a sense of certainty.
Mm.
One gets the relief of having some schema that explains the world or reduces that complexity to a series of simple principles. And it's reassuring, it's relieving. But as you point out, it's not, it doesn't necessarily work. There's this great book called True Believer by Eric Hoffer. He wrote it, I think it's in the 50s or 60s or so. It's an interesting book about ideologies and why, what happens to people when they get sort of into ideologies of some sort. And he said that if you want, power of a doctrine is not in its efficacy as much as it's in its certainty.
Mm.
Which means the thing that's attractive sometimes about an ideology or a doctrine, such as the polarity teaching, which, as you correctly say, tends to be very ideological, is that it doesn't matter really if it works. What really is attractive about it's not if it works, because how can we even tell if it works? When you first get interested in something, you don't know. It's the promise of what it might have for you, this idea of certainty. Oh, I see now what we've been doing wrong. I've been doing this behavior which doesn't fit with what it says here, and so that's why it's all bingo. If I can only just relax and be led, or if I can just take charge and so on and so forth, and that will fix everything. It's of course not very naive. Very naive.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, I love what you've just said there. Yeah. We do tend to love certainty, don't we? Like there's some relief that comes with that, and the promise of that. Yeah, that really does make a lot of sense. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think one way to relate to these sorts of ideas, if one is attracted to them, or if one's teaching them, and is asking oneself, which I think is a good question to ask, do I really know if this works? How do I know this works? Why am I doing this? Am I a meaning merchant? Am I selling certainty? Am I selling, am I myself propagating it because I want to make myself feel more certain and so on? This sort of idea doesn't really work, If you're questioning that, or you're interested in exploring those things, I think it's good to take it as an experiment, as an exploration.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think it's good to take it as an exploration, and just try it on, almost as a game. But not, as you say, as a lifestyle. That would be smart, I think. And to recognize that it's a very limited view that works sometimes in some contexts, or points to something maybe beyond it, but it's itself, it's quite a limited ideological view, I think. Mm. Driven more by the payoff of certainty than it is by its efficacy. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it certainly it works, I think, well as a marketing strategy, focusing on the pain that people are trying to relieve with this particular ideology. That really makes sense. What I'm wondering is, from how can I put this? So I love everything you've said there about, playing with this, treating it as an experiment, discovering what actually is useful to you as an individual. I think that's probably wise advice for most things in life, actually. What I was just pondering is, if we see that there's that kind of, if you've got a hammer, everything looks like a nail at the kind of far end of this ideology. And then we're looking at it as in, okay, it's only got use in, literally when you're in the bedroom and having sex, there it could be really useful to create an erotic spark. It feels to me there's something that lies between those two that is where the juice is, like where there is a place to play and create an experiment from. This isn't a nice, neat question. I'm trying to work my way to one. And I think it's easy to end up being within that is a spectrum in itself, isn't it? It's only here when you're having sex, or it's here and it's everywhere in life. And And I do really feel like there's something between those two or beyond those two, which again, for me is the really interesting part. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, because I think it could have sounded like you're saying, so if the ideology part isn't useful, the only thing that is useful is the other end of the extreme, where it's only useful in the bedroom. And I don't think that is what you're saying, but I'd love to know what you are saying.
Well, I think I was attempting, I suppose, to differentiate.
Well, you were saying that, just to be clear. I think I was just trying to get to a point of asking you a question.
Yeah, quite right. No, I understand. Well, a problem is that we may not be talking about the same thing. So polarity teachings and so on, and you're mentioning that you've seen a lot more of that in your particular sphere of coaching in the last 2 years and so on. Of course, as you know, it's been around a long time, this idea. And sometimes, actually, if we talk a bit about the range of it, sometimes it's a lifestyle. It's a lifestyle. Often it can be quite reductionist gender roles, typically something along the lines of the man leads and the woman follows. Mm-hmm. Now, that's a heteronormative view and quite reductionist. It has often been talked about. I don't suppose that's really what you mean. What I take it to mean these days is, in its giving it its best interpretation, is a way of kind of creating a kind of field of attraction, just like electricity or magnetism with positive and negative poles. It helps if one. How do I put this? It's very difficult to frame it in quite the way. I think it's best thought of as for the erotic or sensual aspect. Doesn't mean it's only when you're having sex, because to think that the erotic and sensual starts when you're having sex is, of course, not quite right. Mm-hmm. But for it to occur in normal conversations with your partner, or when discussing financial matters, or talking about deep themes of life and so on, is it necessary for people to take a posture following some sort of teaching of polarity to differentiate themselves artificially? I don't think so, no. But if you want to reclaim a spark or explore different ways of expressing the erotic connection, and sometimes it's nice for one to take the lead more and the other one to relax and be taken on a journey. And you can switch that around, for example. Sometimes it's nice to learn skills of that nature. The problem with reducing people to two ends of a polarity and limiting and restricting them to behaviors assigned to each of those ends, for example, and that doesn't have to be masculine and feminine, for example, whatever the polarity is. I mean, that's how it used to be taught, is that the person's much more than that. Mm-hmm. The person has both inside of them. It's holographic in the sense that everything has everything in it. So a relationship has two people in it. A person has different aspects inside of them. So to restrict somebody to a kind of following role or a leading role as a sort of primary relationship dynamic, I think is naive. It can give a temporary sense of relief because, well, it's nice and to have a lot of options cut off. It's nice to simplify things and so on, and experiment with it, I guess. But as a general relational strategy through the ups and downs of life, I think it diminishes people. If they take that as the primary lens of their relationship, and the way to conduct themselves is through adopting a posture on some sort of spectrum of polarity, I think that's a shame.
Yeah, there's something I like that you brought it back to that word posture, because when you said that earlier, what came to mind was there's nothing inherently wrong with taking a posture or playing a role. That can be fun. That can be something we might want to play with.
Exactly.
As a way of living our lives, probably not so good, not so enjoyable. And I was like, yeah, it feels to me, and this is very much, as you said that, I was like, this, my own experience of this is, it's, if there was a kind of deeper intention for my life and kind of the direction I'm going in, is actually to inhabit more of myself, to come back more into just a natural sense of self. Sometimes playing with postures can illuminate aspects of myself that I hadn't yet seen, or aspects of myself that I've got reasons why they're tricky for me to inhabit. That's what just really came, like, for example, I spent a lot of my life, for one reason or another, trauma and all sorts of things, in, I guess, what you could say, more typically masculine way of being, where I would take the lead, control even the vast majority of the time. That actually was a trauma response. That isn't really what feels natural and good to my system. And it's in the work of, like, adopting postures and then noticing what that's what's arising for me in that posture. What do I notice is uncomfortable? What feels good about it? Where are the challenges? That I've actually been able to discover more of myself. But to just kind of keep bringing it back to, like, so right, adopt the posture, really wouldn't be serving, I think, in the longer term. So yeah, it's fascinating to see that I think there's something much deeper available, but if we keep just looking at the postures, we're going to miss it.
Yeah. And as you point out, I like what you said there, that taking postures temporarily, trying on new behaviors, experimenting with different ways of doing things, can be very illuminating and can be quite... oh, something falling down there?
It's the dog knocking at the door. Oh. Hoping my husband will address it.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting to do that. And it's interesting to do that. I'm reticent to, and I've spoken about this elsewhere, but I'm reticent to reduce things to this masculine feminine dichotomy. I think it is the archetypal, if you want, polarity, because, that's the reproductive pairing, it seems, in nature. So naturally, when humans attempt to describe reality or to attempt to describe things, we think of that. I mean, for instance, I used to work in the music business, and they had with XLR cables, which are like plugs basically, and the one with the pins, they called it the male end, and the one with the holes was the female end. Right? You could probably figure out why. And there's nothing male or female about them. It's just a bit of plastic. But so we're, in other words, projecting onto that the reproductive pair that serves as sort of our archetypal duality, if you like. And it's done in religion also. Shiva and Shakti, for instance, often characterized like that. The sun and the moon in different traditions, characterized either as male or female, and so on. Or masculine and feminine, of those qualities somehow. We ascribe those qualities to them. Even someone like Jung, for example, talks about reconciling with the contrasexual aspects of ourselves, the anima or the animus, one's inner opposite gender, if you like. This is how it's been presented. I'm not advocating any of these views. I'm just, reflecting on the ways in which this sort of gender is, there's the dog, gender binary, if you like, reproductive pairs, has taken on a kind of archetypal duality. And that's fine. I think that's interesting. It's not the only way to do it, but I think it's an interesting way of doing it. But to then re-import lessons as to how we ought to conduct ourselves based on the dualities we see outside of us, which we've gendered, I think it can be where some things go wrong. Yeah. It's like, well, gosh, isn't the sun like a man because X, Y, Z? And isn't the moon, like a lady, or mystery, dark, and, sort of thing. Oh, maybe we should be like them. Maybe we should be like that. So we're, in a certain sense, via the moon or the sun, we're looking as humans, as we do. This is what we do. We're looking for the laws of the universe. We're looking for how to behave. We're looking for patterns. We're looking for relationships, connections. I feel connected to this or that. And it's an exploratory process. We can't escape that interconnectedness. So I don't think there's anything wrong with any of that, so long as it's held somewhat lightly or held as a lens, one way of looking at it, not the absolute truth. One way of looking at it. And then you more or less, as long as you're not hurting anybody, you can more or less do whatever you like. Explore these different things and try different things and, identify with the moon and, have a, or the sun or, or Shiva or Shakti or, like you're doing with the lover, for example. And you explore those coordinates. I think it's very interesting. And, I said it's not the only one. Of course, you're in your course, you're doing these different archetypes, right? And they're a little bit like coordinates, I think, like map coordinates on the board of possible expressions a person has. You can think, what is it like to be more in the lover? What does that mean? And use that as a sort of lens. I used to like it in school when they'd say things like, they give you a creative writing brief. They'd say, write a story about, I don't know, a long journey with adversity, or write a story about, I don't know, a mythical creature, visiting modern day Scotland or something. I don't know. And you go, oh, cool. And something about the limit. You can write anything, right? But something about the limit can be quite creative. So I think sometimes it's exploring these ideas, assuming these postures, so long as one doesn't sort of think, yes, this is everything, can be quite creative. I think that's something of what you're saying also, isn't it?
Yes, I really love what you're saying here. So I mean, I'm a real geek for archetypes anyway. So the moment you talked about this archetypal, I was like, yes, I think it's a really helpful lens on this. And it, just like with any archetype, it's so much an invitation to, as you're describing it, kind of creates this container which has some form that you can then create within. It isn't a prescription. It isn't like, okay, so, and even that, it's got some, it's got variation. There isn't kind of like a one size fits all, even if we say, for example, we're going to take the archetype of the lover, but it does have some dimension that you can then say, okay, within this role of this particular archetype, I'm going to create this way. And that can so easily become a stereotype, which has this kind of much more limiting, prescriptive, if you are this stereotype, this is how you should identify and be and live within, versus, I think, looking at the masculine and feminine as archetypal energies, as I certainly do, it does feel to me so much more like this is an invitation that you can play within. There is no kind of like, you should be this or that. It's like a choice. Are you accepting the invitation to play within this archetype? I think that's and I think coming back to what we were saying earlier, I think this again is a very human thing. We do have a tendency to turn archetypes and stereotypes, which I think is what's happening. I think a lot of what we talk about, this shadow and polarity world, that's what's happening.
Yeah. And, it is, yes, you're right. And I think that's, for all kinds of reasons, naivety, marketing, ease of marketing, craving for the certainty of ideology, and perhaps many other things, maybe many other things as well. Yeah, you're right. And I think if one explores these sorts of ideas with what you're describing, this context actually, that it's only a facet of a diamond. It's not the whole thing. It's just one way of going in. Then I think that's a very much more healthy way to explore these things, and a much more healthy way to teach them as well. Much more healthy way to teach them. And one might think, well, gosh, but the doctrinal certainty is so compelling, such a compelling sales tactic. Discover your inner X to get this result, and so on and so forth. Yeah, of course, that's compelling, but I think it's not a good idea. I don't think it's a smart idea, because you might get the sale, but life is not all about getting a sale at any cost, is it? Mm-hmm.
It really isn't. No. So I was just chuckling at that's not a good idea. You've got a real way with kind of understatement. Earlier you said something like relationships can be difficult. That made me smile as well.
That's also part of what makes it interesting. The complexity, it's interesting because you're actually in a relationship with a person, and that's interesting because there's somebody there, a real person, hopefully, right, looking back at you with infinite variety of possible expressions and this sort of thing, and then you put that into the context of life, which is also really quite fascinating in that regard. And it's amazing. That's part of what makes a relationship interesting, is that it's a real person and not just like you say, a stereotype, or not reducing someone down to a function, a relationship function, or an erotic function. Lead, follow, something like that. To reduce someone to a function like that, that's, like I say, it could be interesting to do it every now and then for fun, but to take that any further, I think is you lose a lot. What you gain, you lose a lot, and that's always the case, isn't it? With ideology of various sorts, you gain certainty, you gain righteousness, you gain clarity as to what to do next, but you lose nuance. You lose nuance and humanity.
Yeah.
Right? You lose the heart, actually, to relate to somebody as a function as opposed to as a person. So I think.
As you're talking, then I was thinking, gosh, this is happening. There's a quote I love by I think it's a Jungian psychologist, Carl Rogers, and some of my favourite quotes are his, and he has one that's what's most personal is most universal. And so I'm always noticing if I kind of go to say, yes, we do this as humans, I then straight away think like, oh, where do I do this? Like, it's not them, it's me just as much, or if it's me, it's them too. And as you're talking, I was thinking, yes, this feels as though there's this very human tendency where we're kind of brought to life and inspired by the idea, the possibility provided by archetype. So we kind of like, that captures our imagination. We're obviously so wired to be drawn in by myth and story and the archetypes held within them. So, as soon as that possibility is brought into our world, this idea of like, this archetype is available to me, whatever that archetype might be, whether it be the king or the lover or the masculine or the feminine. And then, so that move is so beautiful, so human, so, like magical. And then we kind of go, okay, I want that, and then collapse it into a stereotype. And it's like, I could just suddenly see like how we can do that move over and over again. It's like, it is filled with all this gorgeous possibility. And then because for the reasons you've said, we like certainty, we kind of collapse it into, it becomes this quite one-dimensional stereotype that we're then in relationship to. And I'm not saying that has to happen, it always happens, but I can see that is a pattern that we often follow as humans.
Yeah, that certainly can happen, yeah.
Certainly. And I think something to probably be aware that may well happen if we're not noticing the way that happens.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah. Yeah, it is a danger, but as you said, it's not an inevitability. It's not an inevitability. I think in a certain sense, we've talked in this conversation about, we started off the dangers of reductive relationship advice. Basically, let's face it, it's some sort of reductive relationship advice. We've extended that, talk about any kind of exploration and how can we explore different ideas and different ways of being and different ways of expressing ourselves without being trapped by them. And that's really what we're saying, I think, or at least that's my understanding of what we're saying. And yeah, it's important not to get trapped by them if we can. Yeah, I think you're right. But it's not inevitable.
It really isn't. It really isn't. I think I just think that possibility inspired aspect of humans is gorgeous. And I think the more we're coming from that, again, playful, experimental, choosing in of these different possibilities, the less likely we are to get into that kind of rigid, reductionist way of being. It feels as though the answer is there inherently humans. Yeah.
I like to say one of my favorite phrases is inquiry over imposition. As a general teaching philosophy, inquiry over imposition. So rather than imposing one's idea of how it should go or what the person should experience or how they should act, presenting it more as an inquiry. And that may involve setting up certain structures or giving certain exercises, like you said, or that setting some sort of a container. Sure, it may involve that, but that's in support of the inquiry or the investigation, if you want, the discovery of the learner or the client or whatever it is, something like that. So I like that kind of view, and it's good for a few ways. Inquiry over imposition, because it enables the client to find more in their experience than you had anticipated or had planned for them. That's very interesting. Of course, we come in with an idea sometimes of what we'd like, what we think is likely to be a positive outcome, but the client may find something much more specific and unique to them, and maybe even something we didn't expect. But they find it because there's that space of inquiry. Same exercise can be given in an impositional way. This is how you should act. An inquiry way. Try this and see what happens. Quite different. It also protects us. I think protects the client also from our great idea, our current great idea. Like you said, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Oh, you read something, you learn something, you take a training or so, and suddenly you've got, everything looks like a polarity issue, or everything looks like a Jungian issue, or like you said, or whatever it is, where everything's trauma. Well, so the inquiry allows for an emphasis in inquiry allows for more flexibility, I think, in that. So it protects a little bit the client from our great idea. We can have great ideas, but we're not going to enforce them or impose them. But also it protects us. Now we're talking, say, from the position of a coach or a therapist or a workshop teacher or whatever, because it allows us to evolve. Hasn't it been the case? It certainly has for me. I've believed things in the past or held certain views in my life that as the years have gone by, I've come to a different view. Either it's nuanced or maybe sometimes gone in a completely opposite direction as I've learned more, etc. So if we have this inquiry-based approach, then it allows us actually to change our views, evolve, learn more, nuance, expand, and so on, rather than putting the flag in the ground, saying this is the doctrine, this is how you do it, and then you spend the rest of your career basically defending that, crystallized in that. Feels very true. It feels very complete, this view. I'm going to propagate this, okay? But it won't feel as complete in 5 years' time. It may still be very true in aspects, but it's going to be nuanced. There's going to be other information and experiences that are going to nuance that view, maybe even to the extent that you take a rather different view. That's natural. It's normal. You can't get away from that. If you wait until you have the perfect system before you say anything, then you'll never say anything. So how can we not only protect those that we work with from our fallibility a little bit, how can we also allow ourselves that growth? But that, I think that's also important. So this idea of inquiry over imposition, it's something we emphasize. Michaela and I, we do teacher trainings and these sorts of things, and it's a core, if you want, theme that we discuss. How can we guide exercises? How can we guide explorations, not in an impositional way, but in a way that promotes inquiry and investigation?
Oh my goodness, I'm so with you on that. It's I love the way you've named and distilled that. It's the way I guess I hold this is I'd probably name it as kind of Socratic teaching. I think it's also been called Maetic teaching, which is kind of almost like a midwifing of what's already there. Is kind of like birthing the understanding or the knowledge of the person you're working with. And I think for all the reasons you've said, that, anything, but particularly these things where we do have this sense of kind of like, okay, I know how it is, I'm certain. I think that's just, such a wise way to approach things. The time has flown by. We're almost at a close, which, I have no idea how this has gone so fast. So bringing it back, I feel like we've gone halfway around the universe at this point, which I'm completely down with. Bringing it back to where I think you summed it up really nicely, kind of like not so good relationship advice or something, where you summed up what this kind of broader thing was about. To kind of end with something that might be, I guess, helpful or practical for listeners that, we've talked about topics like this lots of times on the show, and I think listeners probably will have heard something quite fresh and opening in this conversation. What would you suggest might be a nice next step for them, having heard something in this that resonates for them? What would you suggest?
Well, I think one takeaway to consider is that you have more range than you think. You have more range than you think, and it's okay to try different things, and it doesn't necessarily have to define you. Just because you experiment with something or try something, it's all right to do that, and see what it's like to approach things as an inquiry rather than a search for ultimate truth or the final or the end of inquiry, looking for the answer that ends the search, ends the questioning, to instead, in a sense, just to develop the question and try different things with this openness. I think that's useful, and to recognize that fundamentally relationship is about people. And it's about the connection between those people. And sometimes it's about family as well, if you have that. And not to lose sight of the core, if you like, of the heart of the care, the human care, as we explore various different things. If we have that, I think at the base, kind of kindness, if you like, or care, attempt to retain contact with that, then that also, I think, goes a long way. And then we can play and inquire and explore all different ideas. Some
I love what yes, I love what you said for two reasons. One, you've there named one of my takeaways. So you've done my job for me. Oh. So thank you for that. The other thing is it evoked one of my favourite poems, a Rilke one, where he says it's something like, treat those questions like locked rooms and live into the question, and then one day you may live into the answer. If the answer was given to you now, you wouldn't be able to live them. Like what you've just said there really evokes that for me. So thank you so much. Thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure. Really has. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Leanne. I've enjoyed it also.
Wonderful. If people, and I'm sure they would like to find out more about you and your work and your offerings, where's the best place for them to go?
Well, they can look at the website guruviking.com. Although if you want this sort of themes that we've been discussing now to do with relationships, actually the better site is the site of my co-teacher, Michaela Boehm. Michaela, Michael with an A, and then Boehm, BOEHM.com, Michaela Boehm. There you'll find a lot of the work we do together in this field, and lots of podcasts and courses and cool things there. So that's the place, I think, really to do with these themes that I would suggest.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Oh my goodness. What a glorious show. I really loved that. Here were my takeaways. There's been an increasing trend in the personal growth field around teaching polarity, which can be an absolutely wonderful thing. And it can reveal deep wounds that we don't benefit from ignoring and blindly doubling down on polarity techniques to address. I loved Steve's example of when we embark on a new physical exercise, it can reveal an underlying injury or imbalance, which requires addressing, not just doing more of the exercise. Steve referred to the message of the book, The True Believer by Eric Hoffer. The power of a doctrine is not in its efficacy as much as it's in its certainty. Polarity teachings very much offer that certainty and can be wonderfully expansive and revealing if we enter them as a game or an exploration rather than as a doctrine. Playing with polarity as a lens on life and holding poses to see what they illuminate can be a powerful way of understanding our edges, shadows, and possibilities. And lastly, remember that relationships are really about people. And no matter the explorations we're in, we can bring love to whatever we do. If you'd like to get notes and links for everything we spoke about this week, hop on over to the show notes at primalhappiness.co/episode 351. And if you're feeling the call to be your medicine, go take a look at primalhappiness.co/medicine now, and you can book your call with myself or Jonathan to explore fully if indeed it's aligned for you to join us. And we are doing a very special Facebook Live together into the Primal Facebook group on the topic of why you being your medicine is a gift to the world at 4:30 on the 24th of January. If you go to the Primal Happiness Facebook group, facebook.com/group/Primal Happiness, you can register your interest on the event there. And if you don't want to miss out on next week's episode, head on over to Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or your app of choice and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll get each episode straight to your device as soon as it comes out. Thank you so much for listening. You've been wonderful. Catch you again next Tuesday.